In 2024, it is a popular topic to jump onto Ubisoft. They aren't exactly the greatest company of all time. Everything from the way that they treat staff, their fake appeal to equality even though they didn't even have faith in Kasandra being the lead character because, you know, she was a female and for some reason they thought that that was a negative in some way to the audience, all the way through to making games that are bloated with unnecessary choices and making a game, simply put, a far cry from what they used to be. I want to dive deep into the ups and downs, specifically though how this one year in particular that I believe changed Ubisoft forever and how I believe it actually ended up creating what you see today. Today I'm going to be taking you on a journey of the first games that I tried within the Ubisoft umbrella and how they influenced my life even to this day. The notorious year for Ubisoft that changed the trajectory of everything about every game that they make and simply put all their business practices into the bin because they're completely awful and scummy in the way that they do business with players. And then lastly, do I believe that they have the ability to come back from this massive nosedive? So grab a cup of tea and join me in discussing the year that ruined Ubisoft forever. One of the first ever games that I played that was a Ubisoft title was from the Rabbids franchise. However, I was a very young kid at that point of time and I had no clue who Ubisoft actually were. The first proper game where I can remember the Ubisoft logo appearing, and it actually took notice, for me anyway, was Assassin's Creed 2. I had recently got an Xbox 360 for my birthday and my friend decided to bring over his copy of Assassin's Creed 2. I fell in love with the game from the get-go and I ended up having to beg my mum to pick it up for me, and as she is a great mum, she chose to pick it up. I spent so much time playing this game and loved every moment of it, doing the parkour puzzles and all, everything for Altair's armor all the way through to random assassinations. But what this game was doing was making me more and more hyped for the next titles that I could check out. I found myself mainly interested in Assassin's Creed, but Far Cry and Tom Clancy games for me weren't the most appealing things at the time. Other players, however, absolutely loved these games. You saw the original Assassin's Creed game doing amazingly well for genuinely a gamble of a project. We saw Far Cry 3 get released and being one of the biggest successes for Ubisoft at the time and considered one of the best games ever made by Ubisoft. You even have games like Splinter Cell and AC Brotherhood and Revelations, then 3, all come out over the course of just a few years. This was peak Ubisoft. This company from the outset, if you look at release after release, was getting out as many games that were really high quality as possible. You could see this from the sheer abundance of releases. However, something changed. In 2013, we saw the release of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Everything was on the up and up for Ubisoft. Every single game release seemed to be pure gold. However, the company was still doing one thing that it does to this day, but at the time it was doing really well, which was releasing games in such quick windows. But all of this did come to a head in 2014. 2014 saw the release of 4 specific games. You might be thinking, well, wasn't there just primarily 3 big ones of that year? But that's because you probably forgot about the 4th. The 4 games are Watch Dogs, Far Cry 4, and Assassin's Creed Unity. And that 4th game that I was on about is Assassin's Creed Rogue. Let's start off with Watch Dogs though. This was quite possibly one of the most hyped games at the time, and it all stemmed from one moment at E3 2013 where they showed off this game, and well, it looked amazing. It was shown off as this next level game. However, when the title eventually came out, it wasn't exactly what was on the packaging. It looked far worse than it did in the showcase, and that didn't exactly bode down well with players. This was probably one of the first instances on a large scale of misleading marketing and overpromising and underdelivering to their gaming audience. It was the floodgates opening, as during this time, more and more money was being funneled into it. We saw a game get released that in all honesty wasn't actually a bad game. They didn't need to show off the game as they did in E3, as it actually isn't even that bad anyway. Everything about the game is actually pretty good, besides maybe the driving. Ubisoft took a massive reputation hit in this moment, as typically they were viewed as a game company that was actually making good quality games. Maybe they had some flaws, but for the most part, they were able to get these games out there that had tens of hours worth of gameplay that you would enjoy. It wasn't an issue about whether or not the game was polished enough at launch, which there was problems on launch. However, the primary issue was that people felt as if they were missold. It was a glaringly obvious issue that you couldn't avoid or wave away. Then we got to November, where we saw the release of 3 games. all three presumably AAA, however that depends on what your definitions are of a AAA title. Let's talk about the least controversial of the three, and I'll explain where I have issues as well with this title, which is Far Cry 4. This game was received really well and definitely gained more favour over time though. This is a typical trait of Ubisoft games. However, this game was the first Far Cry game to start off the trend of just the copy-pasting of every single title and formula. We had genuine improvements between each game previously. Even Assassin's Creed, you could clearly see the jumps between at least the first 3 to even 5 previous titles. This was starting to set in stone the future of Ubisoft, which was allowing their previous successors to stagnate them and their franchises. The other issue for this game though is that it came out after Far Cry 3. Similar to how AC3 gets looked back at fondly, but when it first came out it was in the shadow of the Ezio trilogy and wasn't viewed particularly well. This is the same case with this game. People didn't necessarily think the game was bad, but it was a shadow of the game that they were considering one of the best and most amazing games to ever come out at the time. The issue that truly got most of the attention that year was the release of Assassin's Creed Unity. It even to an extent overshadowed the issue with, Watch Dogs. And it wasn't just this game though. We also saw Rogue have plenty of issues, but again, it was overshadowed by its bigger brother. The launch of Unity was rocky to say the least. Assassin's Creed Unity was the first ever massive game to be released in the state that was considered unacceptable. It was the original broken game that caused big issues in the gaming space. It was a taste of what was to come with the likes of Cyberpunk later down the line. This game is the definition of releasing to a schedule instead of to completion. Everything from bugs that lost characters' faces to people falling from the sky, this game had it all and it was a notorious problem. A part of me has always felt as if this was a tad overblown, as when I played the game at launch, I played it through twice, really enjoyed my time with it, and I didn't actually have any issues. However, it doesn't mean that the state of the game itself was acceptable by any means. The game, however, wasn't just lacking in that department. It was a visually stunning game that even holds up to this day. The parkour is genuinely amazing, and the city of Paris is one of my favourite cities in the whole of gaming. However, its story wasn't that great. I enjoyed Unity's story leading up to the halfway point, where the writers just chose to kind of just take the most basic route in storytelling, and it just became a massive depression fest. What we got from this game was corporate greed to hit deadlines and not enough going into the game of actual thoughtful substance. Rogue is the game though that I actually think was the worst atrocity of any. Unity was bad for its bugs, but this game had issues with bugs as well. The fact that it's basically Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flags DLC masked as a game, it was incredibly short and rushed, but most of all, it was a project that again was made for one reason. It was made for money, as they were using this as the last game for the last gen consoles. But what made it even worse was that this title cost the same amount as Assassin's Creed Unity on launch. This game on launch was £50 for a game that is roughly 6 hours long, which I'm not the sort of person who normally correlates value with the story's length, but when you consider that this game not only had the issue of the story being 6 hours, but also most of the time the game was hardly functioning, there was zero effort put into the loading screens, even the trailer itself had no proper effort put into it, even though it is actually one of the cooler trailers, and it's kind of unique in the way that it's done. It's pretty cool overall. However, when you consider the scale of value that the normal Assassin's Creed games got when it came to their trailers, and then you just have Rogue, and there's so much differences, it's insane. Rogue is a game though that I genuinely love. I enjoyed my time with it and what it could have been, but it was definitely an undercomplete product that Ubisoft was getting out there simply put to hit a sell-by date instead of wanting a game that people would actually love because it's an amazing title. What 3 out of the 4 of these games share is that if they were given just a little bit more time in the oven, they could have been 3 massive wins on Ubisoft's record, and probably wouldn't have resulted in what was then to come in just a few years. We're not there just yet though. Firstly, we need to discuss the year itself that Ubisoft is definitely going to look back on as their reckoning. What this year showed to Ubisoft is that they could get away with murder, or at least they thought they could, until eventually people would lose their minds. They could get away with one after another, and another release that wasn't up to scratch. They released what they could literally do at the bare minimum. They were mid-maxing game releases, which is insane to think. They were simply put just quiet quitting when quiet quitting didn't even exist. They released games that were simply mediocre and bordering on scam level products and still were able to make money. This is the lesson that they took away from this year. Us the players realized it was the start of something more severe though, which is what ended up coming later down the pipeline. What that was an even more daunting time for the gaming industry. So let's talk about it. After 2014, we saw the release of plenty Ubisoft games. All of them started to show many signs of the world that was coming for gaming. We got Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which definitely put Assassin's Creed as a franchise in the dirt, due to being yet another game that was similar to all of the previous titles, and it made people more stale about the titles releasing within this franchise. Back then, people were genuinely asking for change from Ubisoft, and they knew that. We saw a big step forward for Ubisoft that actually appeared like maybe they were listening to people, which was that they took a year off the Assassin's Creed franchise. The only big hitting title that came out in 2015 was Rainbow Six Siege, which at the time was yet another half-baked product by Ubisoft, seeming to just want to put their foot in the door of an exploding year-on-year in popularity of the competitive FPS market. I found myself actually enjoying Siege just a couple of years later, and to this day I actually think it's still one of the best FPS games on the market. In 2016, we saw the release of Far Cry Primal, which again was a game that I actually kind of enjoyed on the release. However, I wasn't the, overwhelming opinion of this game, and it wasn't received particularly well, and again was just more proof that Ubisoft seemingly were running out of ideas, or at the very least were terrified to make that massive leap. What was incredibly exciting for me and my friends though was the release of The Division. The reason for this was that it was a really interesting game to us, as we were all massive fans of Destiny. We loved that game so much, and to this day, even though I have many issues with it and I don't play it anymore, the game will always have somewhere to sit in my heart. The Division though took over our friend group for a good month or so. It felt like an amazing extraction shooter, which sadly didn't have enough endgame content, nor did it really have enough main game content to survive the long term. Me and my friends would go back and play it maybe once or twice a year, just because it was an easy thing to jump into and play with your friends, but again, there wasn't much to do outside of getting your character from level 0 to being a machine in the Dark Zone. This game was one of the first ones that I can truly think on that actually had roadmaps in place to make the game something close to what was promised on launch. It probably wasn't, I'm pretty sure R6 had pretty similar sort of things, but my god, did the roadmap for this never get fulfilled on in any way. The DLC was also really underwhelming, and the content added for free was also worthless, hence why it was added for free. It was yet another game that was a letdown. It had tons of potential, but nothing was capitalized on. And in the same year we saw Watch Dogs 2 come out, which didn't come out to much reception. The game wasn't necessarily bad, but it didn't seem to gain that much traction. Hardly anyone was really talking about it, and now, even if you look at people going back and playing it, they'll say that the game is pretty good, but the taint of the first game has always taken away from this game's success. As Ubisoft end up becoming well known for is that they end up releasing not just those titles, but another 3, which again were just more Ubisoft making money for the sake of it, and having more quantity instead of quality products. And we saw much of the same with the years to come with the likes of Ghost Recon Wildlands and For Honor, both being titles that are actually quite good, with amazing potential, but weren't capitalized on properly, and also had very little support at launch, where if they were given that support, these games would be massive powerhouses in their own respected fields. This period was when day one patches were becoming even bigger of a thing, but they weren't necessarily day one anymore. They were more like first month, and even like games like For Honor, where they just weren't really playable for even the first year. In 2017, however, we did see the release of Assassin's Creed Origins, which for many of us was a massive thing. It showed that Ubisoft were actually listening to what players wanted, which was that they still wanted Assassin's Creed, but they didn't want the same thing that they had had over and over again. This game was received incredibly well, and many consider this to be one of the best Assassin's Creed titles within the entire franchise, with Bayek being one of people's favourite characters. It was actually done really well, and that's something that I can definitely say Ubisoft did do right, which was Assassin's Creed Origins. There was some issues with the game, but fundamentally for what players wanted, it was pretty much what people were asking for. Even the DLC for this game was actually good content. However, this game was definitely a Trojan horse for what Ubisoft were then later going to pull down the line. This game got a lot of praise, so they were able to get away with something that they did do in this game, which was a bit scummy. Well, not a bit, entirely, which is microtransactions, which at the time was met with a lot of questioning and disdain about why a single player game even has them in the first place. As it stayed relatively true to the franchise though, it allowed them to get away with this, as they did genre jump, give people what they wanted, which was a new take on the Assassin's Creed experience, so that was kind of overlooked. The sad part, however, is that when you realise that this game, along with many of the next titles to come by Ubisoft, were made from the ground up for one thing, which was to get you to pay more for XP boosters and consumables. It was set up solely to make you want to purchase them because they need more money. They wanted to prey on us and extract as much cash as possible. This was the era where single player titles were starting to release with more than just their price tag and maybe a DLC that you were paying for. They now had the psychological tools embedded to make you pay even more money to Ubisoft. With the release of Origins, people kind of started to welcome them back into the fold. The negativity around Watch Dogs and Unity had started to fade a little bit. Obviously, there was still some who were clinging onto it, but what Origins showed to the people is that they were being listened to. Ubisoft, yes, they want to make money, they want to add microtransactions to the game, but they were still making a good product once again. But again, this was all kind of just a big facade. And in my opinion, Origins was designed in the way that you could look at it as the most malicious, which is that they did it to get into the good graces of their fan base and the wider audience, so that when they release their next game that has even more scummy tactics built in, they could capitalize on it fully. It showed that they were able to make a good game, they could make a good open world experience, and that as a company, they could actually be still one of the bigger competitors on the scene. Around this time, I also started to get into R6, and I was absolutely loving my time with it. This game, though, also had seemingly every single issue that everyone was starting to hate with multiplayer titles, which was endless microtransactions, which also were somehow, because of Ubisoft, embedding themselves into single-player games, as previously mentioned. Due to more and more companies being publicly traded and more investors entering into Ubisoft, they ended up having to figure out ways to make more money, and in turn trying to kill off their player base by doing so. They even did a genius thing with the likes of R6 where, oh, you want to play as this new character? Well, get the season pass and you can get access to them. Or, you know what, buy some R6 tokens where you can't refund them because we're not going to allow you to refund in-game currency once you've bought them because you've now got a different type of currency. And you can then buy the character. Or did you want a cool skin for that character's gun that they're using, or a charm? Well, that'll be another £10, please. All of this was setting up a look for a company that seemingly wanted to get away with making games as quickly as possible with as little depth as needed to just get by, just so that they could come out with a Trojan horse and extract as much from you as possible. Over the years following 2017, you saw a lot of games come out from Ubisoft. The same sort of stuff was happening. You had Assassin's Creed Odyssey release, which was the straw that broke the camel's back for many players who absolutely adored this franchise. That was the game that, in my opinion, was probably the biggest middle finger to the core fan base of this franchise, the one that would actually, break many of the people who actually loved what this franchise was. They used Origins as a gateway, as proof of concept that it could be done, that they could do these things and make people, enjoy the Assassin's Creed franchise. But instead, what they did with Odyssey was they just tried to target the most normie player. Even though a lot of people do consider Assassin's Creed a normie sort of franchise, which, to be fair, it is for the most part, I think Odyssey solidified that and showed that there was even more of a normie audience available and up for grabs. I know people who never liked Assassin's Creed, who never even cared about it. The only games that they played was the new first-person shooters and maybe the new FIFA, but they wanted to check out Odyssey and they loved the title. My personal belief on Odyssey is that I wasn't much of a fan of it on launch, but I am willing to give it a second chance. I'm willing to play it because, as many do put it, it's a good game, just not a good Assassin's Creed game. And for me, I do believe that they just should never have put the Assassin's Creed title in the place of Odyssey's entire title, the same with Valhalla. If they wanted to tell these stories, they should have just done it without these things. And one of the other things that I haven't mentioned since the beginning of this video is Ubisoft's false connection to identity politics. I'm not a content creator who typically goes out and talks about these sorts of things, as I don't really care about it that much in the gaming space. As in my opinion, if you make a good game, then I'll probably play it. If it's a bad game and the reason for it being a bad game is that you blew the budget on hiring people who are politically motivated in the way that they're making their game, then I think it's a valid criticism to throw at it. However, for me, typically that isn't the issue that I have with it. What I did find an issue with, though, was having multiple main characters. It wasn't done well like you had within Syndicate, where you had Evie and Jacob Fry with a dual character as a main character instead of just, doing what this game did where you could choose your sex. Why was this implemented? It makes no sense to me. Honestly, I don't know. It doesn't make any logical sense to me outside of just trying to bring in more players, and that's about it. However, the real reason for saw this, even though I said I didn't really know. The real reason for this is that Ubisoft themselves, even though they claim and put themselves out there as being a pro-woman and pro-diverse company, and they want more female representation, they didn't believe a female main character would work and actually make sales go through with this title. I would have played this game at launch, even if it had a female main character. A lot of people would. Yes, a tiny, very minuscule, minute section of the population would have an issue with this, but fundamentally, choosing to have two was just a bad choice. Just focus on making a good game, and most people won't care about who the protagonist is. To me, this was the first moment where Ubisoft were truly playing at politics, trying to use something to gain brownie points, but fundamentally not even trusting the claim that they said that they believed in. We also got the likes of Far Cry 5 and The Division 2 and Ghost Recon Breaking Point. Again, multiple games there that they just kind of, just pushed out. They didn't push the needle in any way to make any solid dent in the minds of players about these games being overly different. It was Ubisoft focusing again on a release window for shareholders and revenue of not good products, just a load of them. Where the fun times for Ubisoft truly take a nosedive though was 2020. This year probably had a bigger impact on the company than 2024. However, my thesis is that 2024 is the reason for this trajectory and why 2020 happened. They tried in 2024 to bring new projects out, more innovation, and actually create a better quality experience from its looks. Even with the bugs that Unity had, it still saw a good chunk of improvement from the previous titles. But they ended up seeing, obviously, massive failure from 3 out of the 4 of their projects. This wasn't the thing though that they took away from it. They didn't take away any of the right lessons. Instead of focusing on quality games with bigger gaps between releases, we saw as many as 5 AAA titles release in a given year. Just because they gave a 2-year gap between Odyssey and Valhalla doesn't mean that they learnt their lesson. Assassin's Creed Valhalla will be my main focus here, as again, Watch Dogs Legion was like Watch Dogs 2 and it didn't really gain too much traction, not much spotlight outside of paying creators to talk about and play their game. Valhalla was probably the biggest and one of the most hyped for titles of any Assassin's Creed entry, and for Ubisoft was by far the game of the year for them and that they needed to focus on. I even bought a Series X on pre-order as I wanted to play this game on release. I was fully bought into the hype. We got told by Ubisoft that there was going to be more focus on assassins, being more stealthy and the return to normalcy, the return of social stealth, no more boosters or microtransactions, and above all, a great experience. This game is the epitome of what Ubisoft are. Ubisoft are willing to lie, falsely advertise, and create bloatware with zero repercussions. This game is considered their most successful, and I want to debunk this claim. It may have made over $1 billion. Cool, that's great for them. But let's ask the question, how? Do we really think it was all from game sales, or maybe just by some random coincidence, it could be the boosters that were added to the game and the endless microtransactions? Oh yeah, those things that they claimed weren't going to be in the game. They literally came out and claimed that they wouldn't be in the game, but they were there. They added them in after a month of good press for not doing it, and they shoved them in anyway. You also see the number 20 million thrown around a lot, and people conflate this player count number for copies sold. This game wasn't successful because of how many copies they sold. It was successful because they lied to their customer base about the game that they were getting, showed very specific gameplay to creators, something that even though Luke Stevens gets criticized for at this point currently, he actually made one of the greatest points about it, which was that he called out this issue. They even had 3 occasions where they gave free-to-play weekends for this title. The game has also been sold for as little as £12, and it's on Game Pass, and on top of that, it was on PlayStation Plus as well, both coincidentally lining up with before Ubisoft's announcement of 20 million players. This game wasn't successful in its player count because it was a good game. People gave it a chance as it was thrown into a big catalogue of games that they were paying for, so it was pretty much free. It was only monetarily successful because of its microtransactions. This game is the epitome of what happened in 2014, but all rolled in to one game. Ubisoft's image was forever tainted after the release of Unity, and over time was pushed further and further into the mud as they released game upon game that was the same thing as before with tiny tweaks, while saying screw you to their pre-existing player base. It all accumulated into Valhalla, a game that is bloatware. The only two good things about this game is its graphics and its modern day story. Besides those, it fails in almost every metric you can use for an open world RPG experience and an Assassin's Creed game, which again shouldn't have even been in the title in the first place. This game combined the misleading marketing of Watch Dogs, offering a false experience to the content creators who were going to go and talk about the game publicly, and focusing in on the elements of the game that were entirely useless, while also providing an experience that wasn't even polished. This game wasn't entirely functioning properly at launch. The biggest issue for me, however, was the microtransactions, and claiming that they weren't even going to be in the game in the first place, and then changing their minds. Most likely because it gave them good credit at the beginning, made more faith in them as a company and the game itself, but then again, they need to make money, and compelled by their own greed and arrogance of what players will accept, they shoved them back in. Valhalla tainted Ubisoft's reputation forever, and it all stems from 1 year where they seemingly tried to bring in the first new title in a long time and failed, destroyed the formula of AC into the ground, and completely learnt the wrong lessons from what 2014 should have taught them. 2014 for me, if I was Ubisoft, would have made it clear that I needed to stop releasing these big projects in such quick succession of each other, allow them to be slower releases, allowing for polish and focusing on good storytelling and good world design. It should have also taught them not to lie about their game. Show off a game on the console that you'll be selling it on and how it actually looks at launch. Literally, just wait. Wait until a few months before launch before you even start showing actual gameplay, and show it on a console that you're going to be releasing it on. But no, instead we saw more and more shafting of us as the players as they continued to put out product after product that clearly had no care truly put into it and was solely done to make as much money as possible. All of this brings me to the final 4 points of this video. The family who run this questionable company, the choices that they have made in their development processes, the greed of the company itself, and whether or not they can even make a comeback. So let's talk about the first of those four, the Guillemot family. This family is the brain of the Ubisoft company. They started the company and they built it to the heights that they did when it was absolutely amazing in the early 2010s. However, they also gained a massive stranglehold over it because obviously it was their baby. Who's going to want to let go of it? There is many people who believe that the family will sell their 15% stake in the company. However, the issue of Ubisoft won't end there with them simply selling their stake, as it's already the case that Tencent own 10% of it, so most likely Tencent will buy out the entire company, or at least the other 15%, and that isn't exactly good as they aren't well known for, great business practices. They're pretty well known for hyper scummy monetization methods, which would be an interesting parallel to Ubisoft. The issues wouldn't also end there. The Guillemot family have done something quite impressive, something that quite honestly, most companies, if they were owned by a family, is what most people would do, which is putting family members and friends into positions of power within the company so that it's pretty hard to do anything without getting them on your side. Even if they sold their stake, if they don't walk away from the company itself, they could stay in charge unless Tencent basically do a massive firing spree and strip away the entire board of directors of Ubisoft. As I've mentioned, one of the issues that I have with Ubisoft is their false appeal to political ideologies. This isn't because I disagree with having political messages within media. This is something that has happened since the dawn of any medium, whether that was books, artworks, movies, music, or games. It's always had some form of political messaging in some way. My issue is when it's poorly done, for no apparent reason, or it's done solely to appeal to an audience that aren't even the players. I already gave you one of my biggest pet peeves, which is the lack of care around Kassandra's character and how they just didn't go fully out with it. One of my favourite characters within this franchise isn't even within a game that I actually like, which is Evie Fry. This character should have been the main character in all honesty, as her brother is insufferable. However, again, Ubisoft intentionally made Jacob have more screen time as they believed that it couldn't wholeheartedly do well in sales, and they didn't really believe in their message that they tried to portray, so they caved to a false ideal of what an audience would react to instead of just releasing the game with a good main character in a good game. We then saw Watch Dogs Legion, where we saw the ability to play as anyone. This feature seemed interesting on a surface level, but once you realize that it's more of a gimmick because you couldn't genuinely make a meaningful playthrough when you just play as anyone, it meant in the eyes of many, Ubisoft was solely going for the idea of inclusivity above anything else instead of making, again, a good game experience for people to enjoy. We saw in Valhalla the ability to gender swap, and no commitment to a particular character for no reason outside of some weird compromise, either due to the lack of faith in a female main character, or because they wanted to keep a selection for people to be happy by not making it a male main character. These are all things that, again, I don't necessarily have an issue with if Ubisoft actually followed through and even tried to make their stances clear, but instead they hide behind trying to have their cake and eat it too. If you want to bring political beliefs into a game, you can, but fundamentally, focus on making a good game above all else. If that game has a female main character, then fine. If that game has a male main character, then fine. If the game is focusing on having a more of an inclusive cast set, then fine. But don't sacrifice things like a game being set within a set location solely for the sake of those said things. You end up ruining immersion and ruining the idea of the landscape that you're trying to show. Fundamentally, the biggest flaw within Ubisoft though is their greed, and with that, their development windows. They don't seem to be interested in ensuring good products, more so having money come in actively. This does seem to have taken a hit on them, however, with the release of Star Wars Outlaws underperforming massively, but also keep in mind that this game was doomed to pretty much be monetarily a failure for Ubisoft because Disney were taking a massive cut on top of the other companies who would take a cut like Xbox and PlayStation for sales. The game not performing well on the sales front showed one thing very clearly, which was that people were getting sick of the Ubisoft system. We saw that this very issue was one of the key reasons that they pushed back the release of Assassin's Creed Shadows, which in all honesty, gameplay-wise, actually looks pretty interesting. This seems like the first time in a long while where they're actually adding things to the franchise and adding a bit more to the gameplay system than they have done in very recent memory. However, again, it doesn't overlook all of the issues that they've had with other titles and all the issues that they've had around the launches of pretty much every single title they have ever released. The issue is though, is that this is all fine and all, and having games released that apparently are going to look good and they look amazing and all these things, but it's not. If you look at their development windows, their general roadmap for the future for more and more games, it doesn't seem like they've learned any lessons. If anything, they've doubled down on what gained them money in the past without doing any proper introspection about how they can solve their situation, which doesn't fill me with hope overall. So let's answer the question: does Ubisoft have the ability to make a comeback? Firstly, I do want to answer that question, which is that I do not think that Ubisoft can actually come back from this, as there are still people out there who will defend Valhalla, who make the claim about it being the most successful game in the franchise, and that people are just whining over nothing. And yeah, with those sorts of people still in the picture, I do believe that Ubisoft will continue screwing over customers left, right, and center. These sorts of people are the same people who would brag about their friend making a ton of money, but they openly know their friend scams elderly people, but they don't care because the person's making the end result of money. Like that's the sort of thing we're dealing with here. So what we're going to do is we're going to roleplay for a second. I'm going to take over the role as the CEO of Ubisoft and tell you what I would do when it comes to the next steps for Ubisoft themselves. And the first thing I would do is obviously finish the release of Shadows and just get it out there. When this game does release though, you then hit the pause button on every single game that is in development. I would then split the Assassin's Creed franchise into two systems: the mainline franchise that are given the Assassin's Creed name, and the second that are labeled under the Assassin's Creed story. This way it would be very simple for people to be aware of what type of game they're getting, whether or not they're getting one that was more true to form of what the old Assassin's Creed games were like, or one that is going to be a world inspired through the lens of the Assassin's Creed world, so you would shove the likes of Odyssey and Valhalla within those. I'd also greenlight Far Cry 7, but completely start revamping the series, focusing far more on bringing back its story elements, making it more realistic, and actually quite possibly adding more survival systems into the game, and I would actually add a similar online mode to something like a DayZ. I feel like it's a fitting series that could get away with it and do well with it. This way the game would have a lot covered and they would be able to do a lot of different areas of gaming in one title. The thing is as well though is that they could also make a lot of money from it. They can monetize that online section far better, but no pay-to-win mechanics in any way would be allowed under my leadership. They would only focus on 2 games at a time. In this case, Far Cry would take over the mantle, as Shadows would then be in the shadows by then, and they could then start working quite possibly on, let's say, a new Watch Dogs game. This game would be more gritty, more hooked in with what the first game was, making more of a focus on a darker, more mature story. Have DLC come out for these games so that people can actually explore these characters in more depth. Once they've completed both of those games, they would then move on to another Assassin's Creed title, but they would also make an entire new game. Maybe something that could be a complete standalone title. Make something new that's unique, that you're not just going to recycle over and over again after it's done well. All of this means for Ubisoft is maybe having a game release every couple of years on average. Maybe having a development window of 4 years, but maybe even for those more ambitious titles out there going for a 6 to 8 year development timeline. The thing is though, the most important part is just that we need to have honest communication with customers. And I'm saying this like I'm already the CEO, okay? Like I might as well be at this point. Don't announce a game until you know for sure that it will be out within the next year. We need more games like Fallout 4, where the studio announces the game and it releases a few months later. This might not build up a massive load of hype for your game, but I will for sure be able to save you a lot of time in reputation damage that the company has gone over under the last few years, as they underdeliver on every single promise for the most part of almost every game that's released over the last decade. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what I would do personally. However, of course, the structure of the company is something that I think is worth tearing apart as well. Having such a massive company that makes a load of 7 out of 10 games at their best needs to have an internal investigation as to how their business runs and why it's so focused on mediocrity instead of making outstanding games. Overall, I did say a moment ago that I don't think that they can make a comeback, and that's because I think they're blinded way too much by money, and they'll pivot onto whatever can make them quick money now instead of what could secure them a future in the industry, or at the very least won't give them the reputation of being a scammy company. They're going to continue down the road of making remakes of older games, bad remasters of others, release more of the same with tons and tons of microtransactions, and create in-game systems that push players to spend even more money on those said transactions. This is the company of instant gratification. They clearly aren't in the game of a worthwhile long-term business that will be around for decades to come and known for making great games. Only a select few companies are able to get away with doing exactly that, because they actually focus on quality products first. Some, for example, like Rockstar, people will consider scummy because of their treatment of GTA 5's online. But guess what? People still love them because no matter what, they can get away with doing these things because they make genuinely good products. People don't care if you make a good game. Just make a good game and you can get away with being a little bit scummy and focusing in on making as much money as possible. Today's video delved more into the aftermath of 2014 and the future of this company. I hope, however, I've been able to show you the ripple effects that caused over a decade of gaming that focused on extracting cash from every corner imaginable. I said this in my Assassin's Creed Mirage video essay. Ubisoft typically take away the wrong lessons from every single failure and their successes. They double down on what makes them money and not what makes them a good company. 2014 was the start of the end for Ubisoft, with moments like Origins and to some Far Cry 5 that actually released decent games, but for the most, when you look back on Ubisoft over the last decade, you see a plethora of game releases, and a handful of them being any good. This company is the definition of throwing shit at a wall until something sticks. And I also don't hope that the company goes under, as I know there is some people out there who wish that Ubisoft would just go bankrupt. However, I don't want them to. I don't want people to lose their jobs because of the terrible decisions by the company itself and the people at the top of it. I just hope that they can rethink their methodology, but as that probably, won't happen. As a whole, hopefully the company will get what it deserves in the end, and they will hopefully maybe have to sell off some of their IP to other people to make better games. With that all being said though, I hope that you did enjoy today's video. Make sure to leave a like and do subscribe to see more content on the channel. If you do want to support the channel though any further and get access to videos early and also behind the scenes as to how I make these videos and how I work on the bigger projects, then make sure to check out my Patreon down below. For now though, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.